in the process of drawing these new lines, legislative as well as congressional, if the experience of our president as an African American is somehow a factor in the approach of his Justice Department, in watching Virginia go about the business of redistricting. Certainly one of the things that President Obama emphasizes is that he's something of a post-racial figure. So one wonders, could that be an X factor in drawing boundaries? I have made the argument that part of the problem with redistricting is that politicians are shopping for voters as opposed to voters shopping for their politicians. And it is redistricting that has empowered these narrow bands of the electorate. Tom Rust is here, and I'm going to embarrass him. Tom Rust is, he's one of those Republicans who believes in life after birth. Yeah. Right? Okay, you don't have to answer that question. But it's tough to be a Tom Rust in Bill Howe's House of Delegates. And then on the other hand, there are districts that are just constructed to produce, if you will, liberal Democrats. And their worries, much like conservative Republicans, is what's the threat from within the party? And then all these men and women are sent to Richmond, and they're thinking about preservation and accumulating seniority and trying to exercise power. And do they talk to each other? They seem to talk past each other. And the added complication, I think, is that this creates is creating an incurious legislature. Legislatures are supposed to be provincial, parochial bodies. But what has happened, I think, as redistricting has become more precise in its partisanship, legislators, for example, are thinking less about bigger picture issues and more about the one or two hot buttons they have to hit to win and hold office. That over a decade or so, they just don't think a lot about bigger issues. And what that has, I think, created is a situation in which lobbyists, who often are experts in the interests they represent, really become the repository of kind of institutional memory within the legislature, and then combine that knowledge with the power of their checkbook. I think it gives you a pretty good idea who's calling the tune in Richmond. I'll be back there in January. I'll be cynical and skeptical like the rest of you. Any other questions?
Oh.
Sir.
Jeff, I'm John Jenkins from Prince William County, colleagues of Gordy here.
From the south end of Prince William County?
Yeah, I guess the east part of Prince William County. But I get your drift from your Louisiana background. I wanted to ask you what you thought about your colleagues, or I won't say your colleagues, but the people in the television industry who are taking positions that are parallel or supportive of either party, and the recent revelation of one of your colleagues who made generous contributions, I guess, to one of the parties. Without going any further, I'd like to hear your side of it.
We were talking a bit about this last night, and this kind of polarized environment in which our elected officials at the state level are trying to do the job. It's exacerbated by this polarization we see within the media. Now, of course, MSNBC, Mr. Olbermann's employer, is viewed as the liberal alternative to Fox. And of course, Mr. Hannity, who is one of the more popular faces on Fox, is a generous supporter of Republican candidates. One of the reasons I think these entities do so well is because of the perceived or unvarnished partisanship with which they position themselves. This is not entirely new in American journalism. All through the early days of the Republic and well into the 19th century, this only really started to change in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, newspapers as the principal form of mass communication were peddled with a particular point of view. There's a reason why the daily newspaper in Springfield, Massachusetts is called the Republican. So that changed in the early part of the 20th century. A lot of it had to do with, you may find this hard to believe, the professionalism that established itself within my craft. In 1904, the nation's first journalism school was started at the University of Missouri. I think a lot of that fed journalism, made for more professionalism, greater expertise, but now that of course is changing. People definitely like to hear certain points of view. And the added problem, I suspect, is this is not just making it harder for people to figure out what's going on, it's making it more difficult for politicians to communicate. Jerry Baliles, who was governor from 1986 to 1990, has made this point, and he's among others, that a politician's competition is not just the other politician. If one is living in a community that has cable or satellite service that provides, an infinite variety of alternatives, then that politician's competition is not just the man or woman who wants his seat, but it's 24-hour news, round-the-clock movies, 24-hour sports, reality television, you name it. So how does an elected official tell his or her story when he or she may have seconds to make a point? And I think that what happens in that setting is that the message tends to be very simple, very emotional, and perhaps trivial. Now, if he were here, he would probably argue otherwise, but Governor Gilmore reduced it not just to 3 words, but to 3 syllables. No car tax. And you as local government officials, are continuing to deal with the consequences of that policy. Now, to Governor Gilmore's credit, he correctly identified an anachronistic tax that no one cares to pay. But getting rid of it, or appearing to get rid of it, is really only, one step toward a larger solution, which is something needs to be done about the tax system in Virginia. It's ridiculous that people should be paying a tax every year on a hard asset that declines in value. Not in a state, not in a time when wealth is measured by far more ephemeral things. But anyway, enough of that. Any other questions? Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jeff, for coming. And at this time, we'll dismiss, and we have the sessions and all. And please participate in those. And don't forget, there will be a lunch in the exhibitors hall. I think at 12:30, 12:45, sometime right there. And our first session follows it. Thank you very much.